Since it was the last day of school, our teacher, Mr. Founder, was just happy to return our graded tests and let us bullshit the rest of the period. Kimber talked about the arrangements for the funeral that weekend and chided Kyle and I for skipping finals to get stoned. When the bell rang, I could see that Kimber was both excited and nervous to see Kyle. As we packed up our bags, I assured her that Kyle wasn't mad. He was just worried about her. She threw her bag over her shoulder. She set her jaw and nodded. She was trying so hard to keep it together. As soon as Kyle saw her from down the hall, he slammed his locker door shut and walked toward us with such intensity that we began to wonder if maybe he was mad. He pushed past a dozen people without so much as glancing at them and left a curious if annoyed crowd in his wake. When he finally reached us, Kyle threw his backpack against the wall and swooped Kimber up in a sort of way you'd see in an old black and white movie. Everyone who'd watched all this unfold, including me, groaned in unison. Since most of the teachers weren't even bothering to take attendance that day, I went to calculus with Kimber and Kyle, where they had the same conversation Kimber and I had last period. Toward the end of the hour, the conversation faltered and became uneasy. Kyle and I exchanged a look over the top of Kimber's head, and I nodded at him. "Kimber," he said quietly, "did your mom leave a letter?" "What?" Kimber asked in surprise. "I heard your dad talking about a letter on Tuesday," I said. "Oh." As we waited for her to continue, the bell rang for lunch. Everyone filed out of the room, but the three of us stayed sitting on our desks. "Kimber," I finally said. She sighed sadly and looked over at Kyle. "Yes?" "What did it say?" he asked nervously. "I don't know. I haven't seen it. I asked my dad for it when we got home, and he said I'd misheard him and there was no letter. He said not to mention it to anyone else or I'd just upset people." "Well, then we both misheard him," I said, "which seems unlikely. I've known my dad all my life, and I know when he's lying." People started to filter in for the next period, sliding sympathetic glances at Kimber. Since it was our lunch period, we gathered up our things and walked out to my car, as we always did. I sat in the back seat, letting Kyle and Kimber take the front. Kimber took a deep breath and continued. "I know my dad is lying, and I know he has the letter." "Are you sure?" Kyle asked. I could tell he was still terrified that some of the blame rested on him. "Yeah, and I know it contains the name Prescott. I think I even know where it is." Prescott? Yet somehow I wasn't that surprised. He was the axis around which everything that was bad orbited. "How do you know it says Prescott?" Kyle said. "I heard my dad reading it once. I think he reads it a lot, actually." He was sort of sobbing and whispering the words and throwing things in his office. "My dad. He hasn't been well. Do you think she was having an affair with Jimmy Prescott?" I shook my head. "I'm guessing you need to think bigger than that, Kyle." "I agree," Kimber said to her hands in her lap. "With everything we know about the Prescotts, I'm fairly sure this isn't about an affair. It's all connected somehow, don't you think? My dad was the love of my mom's life, but now she only left the letter for me. I think that somehow I'm the only one she's wronged, not him. You know, I think she did something to me, or maybe she did it because of me." Kimber's voice broke over the last sentence, and Kyle pulled her over, kissed the top of her head, and whispered the words to her that I couldn't hear. "So we need to get the letter," I said, after giving them a minute. "Yes, I really need to read it." Kimber's voice was still wobbly. "How do we get it?" I asked. "If it's in the office, we just need to wait until her dad isn't home," Kyle said as he looked out the window. "Ugh, you don't think I thought of that?" Kimber sighed. "He never leaves his office. Not since we got home from the hospital. He sleeps in there. We need to get him out. No, we need to get me in. Tomorrow's my mom's funeral, and half of Drisking will be there, including my dad, of course. I need to leave without him noticing and run home so I can go through the office." "Okay, that's easy," I said, "without my dad noticing, and I need to be back by the end of the service." We both nodded but stayed silent because it looked like Kimber was debating saying more. "My dad, he's been very cold, and I think he blames me," Kimber finally said. "That's bullshit," Kyle spat. "Can you guys help me?" "Absolutely. Of course." We spent the rest of our lunch hour creating a plan far more strategic than the mission probably needed. Kyle and I would engage Mr. DeStaro in conversation, and then Kyle would get a text from Kimber telling him that she was having a breakdown in the bathroom. Kyle would leave to go comfort her, and they would take my car to the DeStaro house. I would stay behind and keep an eye on Kimber's dad while they were gone. I went to work that afternoon for the first time since Monday. Mira seemed to be in a much better mood and let me go home early since it was a Friday. I didn't sleep well, though, and I got up at 4 a.m. to go through my clothing, looking for something dressy and black to wear to the funeral. My dad came in before he left for work and found his disheveled, panicked teenage son looking helplessly through piles of black clothing. He smiled pityingly and led me to his own closet. Since my dad and I had not only the same face, but the same build, as well as finding something suitable to wear was easy, I thanked him and he asked me to apologize to Kimber for having to work through the service and that he sends his love. Ann DeStaro's funeral was at an Episcopalian church on the other side of town. I picked Kyle up at 9 and saw he was also wearing a suit of his dad's, though he didn't fit in it nearly as well, and he was constantly pulling at the sleeves and adjusting the waistline. Unfortunately for Kyle, he was much smaller than his dad. We parked as far away from the church as possible, where we hoped no one would notice a car leaving. When we went inside the church, we saw that Kimber wouldn't have to do much acting to convince people she was having a breakdown. We found her at the back of the room, tucked into a chair in a puddle of curly orange hair and tears. Kyle sat down next to her and pulled her into a hug. Jesus, Kimber, what's wrong? I kicked his foot and shot him a look that said, really? Kyle bit his lip. Fuck. There's no one here, Kimber whispered against his chest. My mom grew up here. She had hundreds of friends in this town, and no one came. We looked around, and I had to admit the turnout was sparse. A few groups of 3 or 4 people standing together. Kimber's dad, who sat in a chair opposite the room of his daughter with his head in his hands, and some family I recognized from barbecues at Kimber's house. Ex-Sheriff Clary and his wife Grace was there, standing with a few of my dad's deputies and talking quietly in the corner. I could see why Kimber was upset. As we waited for the service to start, I realized I'd never been to a funeral before. I wished that we'd had one for my sister, but I knew we never could since Whitney was still legally alive. It made me sad to think that she would never be laid to rest. Only a few other funeral goers trickled in, and the pastor began getting people seated for the service. I noticed the casket at the pulpit for the first time and was so glad it was closed. Still, I had to wonder at the simple, unadorned, almost ugly coffin which had been chosen for Kimber's mom. I knew the DeStaros had money, quite a lot of it actually. It was an interesting, almost insulting choice. Poor Kimber. Kyle and I stood Kimber up and started over to the pews, but she stopped abruptly. I'm ready, she said, and brushed her hair away from her wet face. Ready to leave. I can't be here anymore. It's a disgrace to my mother. Kimber raised her head a notch and set her jaw. I knew this look, and it meant there would be no reasoning with her. Kyle and I looked at each other. This wasn't the plan. It had been a lot more obvious if Kimber was missing from the service, especially with the low turnout. You guys go over and say what we rehearsed to my dad, Kyle. I will text you in 30 seconds. Go. Kyle nodded and started over, and I knew we weren't arguing. Mr. DeStaro was finally standing, looking over at the front pew reserved for him and his daughters with hesitation. Mr. DeStaro? I said as we approached. I'm very sorry to hear about your wife. She was shit. I'd forgotten my lines. A great woman who raised a wonderful daughter, Kyle finished. Yeah, he spat. Do great women commit suicide leaving their wonderful daughters alone in this world? Shit. Do great women jump off buildings and make spectacles of themselves and leave their families to deal with the publicity and the grief? Kyle's phone chirped. Thank God. Oh, that's Kimber, Kyle said a little too fast before he had time to actually look at his phone. Oh man, she isn't well. She says she's crying and feeling sick. I'm going to help her. No. Mr. DeStaro yelled so suddenly that Kyle dropped his phone on the ground where it made a loud clatter on the stone floors. Not you. You don't help my daughter. You don't even talk to her. He can go. And he pointed at me. Okay, I stuttered. The plan had changed too much. I needed to somehow get the car keys from Kyle without being seen. Kyle gave me a shaky, subtle nod, and then he and Mr. DeStaro went to sit down. It was obvious Kimber's dad was keeping an eye on Kyle. Getting the car keys from him was going to be nearly impossible. I backed into the shadows at the back of the room while the pastor started the service. I texted Kyle 4 times asking for help, but he wouldn't dare touch his phone. He just stared straight ahead, flicking worried glances at Mrs. Testaro every few seconds. After several minutes, I went to find Kimber to see what she wanted to do, but she wasn't in our meeting spot by the back door. The plan was falling apart. I pulled out my phone and sent her a text. "Where are you? Kyle is next to your dad and I can't get the keys from him." I waited in the hallway, tapping my phone against my hand nervously. After a minute or two, my phone vibrated. Kimber texted, "I'm sorry, I left without you guys. I had to get out of there. I'm so sorry. I'll be back before the end of the service. I promise." Shit. I texted her, "Be safe." It was now imperative that I not be seen. I went to the men's bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and played Snake for the longest 20 minutes of my life. I knew this service wouldn't go on much longer, so I texted Kimber again. I texted her, "You on your way back yet? Did you find it?" I sat waiting as the minutes ticked by. I texted her again. "I think the service is ending soon. Where are you?" After another 7 minutes of no response, I tried calling, but it went to voicemail. I tried again with the same result. I was getting nervous. I was about to try a third time when 2 people walked into the bathroom and my phone vibrated with a text. It was Kyle. The service was over. Kyle texted, "Kimber has the keys. Why aren't you guys back yet? Did you find anything?" I left the bathroom without washing my hands and received dirty looks from the 2 strangers at the urinals as the door closed behind me. I found Kyle staring out of the window looking for my car. "Kyle?" He jumped. "Where's Kimber? What did you guys find?" "I don't know. She left without me." "What the fuck? Why? Where is she?" "I don't know, Kyle. She left without me," I reiterated. "She's not even answering my calls or my texts." "Fuck. Mine either. We have to keep an eye on her dad until she gets back." "We're not the only ones," Kyle said, gesturing across the room. "What the fuck is going on?" 3 men were talking to Kimber's dad in the corner across the room. Chief among them was Killian Clary, who was flanked by his 2 former deputies. Driskin's retired sheriff had his hand on Mr. Testaro's arm and was speaking to him in an angry, hushed tone. Kimber's dad was shaking his head and desperately objecting to something. The 2 deputies walked out the front door of the church, and Mr. Testaro sagged against Killian Clary, who sat him in a nearby chair. Something was happening. "Call Kimber now," Kyle said. I tried again, and this time the call rang twice and was sent to voicemail. I ended the call and threw up in my hands, looking desperately at Kyle. "Again," he said, and took out his own phone. I got the same result, but felt a jolt of relief when someone answered Kyle's call. But it wasn't Kimber. "Phil, what part of town are you in? I need a ride. It's an emergency." I waited. "Yeah, man, I'm at Northridge Church. As fast as you can. I'm with Sam. I'll owe you." Kyle hung up and then immediately tried Kimber's phone. "She's sending me to voicemail too." We both stood at the window, anxiously waiting to see Phil's silver Mazda pull up. Kyle chewed his lip and tapped my phone. "Come on, Saunders." We threw occasional looks back at Kimber's dad until Clary stood him up and ushered the now inconsolable man out of the church. Suddenly, Kyle's phone chirped, and we both looked down to see Kimber's name flash up on the screen. Kyle's knees nearly buckled in relief, and he sagged against the wall. Kimber texted, "I found it." Kyle opened the text and furiously typed a reply, "They're coming for you, Kay." We both stared at the phone waiting for a response, and just as the sun blinded us, it reflected off of Phil's approaching silver sedan. We got one. Kimber texted, "They're here." It was the last message we got from Kimber. When Phil dropped us at the Testaro house, we found the front door unlocked and no one home. My car was sitting in the driveway, unlocked with the keys in the ignition. Kyle and I drove back to the church, but the funeral was over, and a few people that had attended it were already gone. We drove back to Kimber's house again, but it was just as we'd left it and no one was home. Kyle had lost it by this time and was an absolute wreck. He called her so many times. I was sure he'd killed her battery. His calls went straight to voicemail and his texts were unanswered. After a half hour of begging from Kyle, I finally called my dad. He answered immediately. "Sammy, what's wrong?" "It's Kimber. She's gone, Dad.